Great. Okay, welcome everybody, including everyone online. Great to have you join us. I'm Tariq, as I hope some of you know, and the director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship that's holding this seminar, which originally was going to be in February and then in March. And now it's finally taking place today because the UCU strike action affected the earlier dates. So I'm very pleased because we've been longing to have this seminar, and I hope this kind of delay has heightened the anticipation to have Dr. Jonathan Chaplin speak to us on how should states recognize religion, inclusion without co-option. I actually first met you, Jonathan. I don't know whether you remember. It was sort of early to mid 1990s. We were both at one of those Morel conferences on toleration, the political theory of toleration, at the University of York. And of course, this was a very heightened time to be talking about religious toleration and freedoms, because it was the height of the Satanic Verses affair. And of course, a lot of the paper givers at this conference were pretty kind of absolutist liberals. And I remember you in particular, because I think we had an affinity, because we were two people trying to say, well, look, there's a little bit more to it than that. Liberals have or should have more commitment than just one absolute commitment. So, and that may have been the last time we met, I can't remember, but anyway, we go back to that period. Jonathan is a political theologian and a fellow of Wesley House, Cambridge, where he contributes to the work of the Centre for Faith in Public Life. His publications include Beyond Establishment, Resetting Church-State Relations in England, that came out last year. The year before came out Faith in Democracy, Framing a Politics of Deep Diversity. And a little bit before that, Stimulating Multiculturalism, a Christian Retrieval. So thank you for coming. Jonathan is going to present for roughly about 50 minutes. And then I hope everyone can stay for the discussion period. We'll go on till either the questions run out or till about 7 or so. And well, let me allow you to get started. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much indeed, Tariq. It's a real pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the invitation, and I've been looking forward to this conversation too. In fact, I recall that conference in York. I think that's where I gave a paper critiquing Will Kimlicker's version of multiculturalism, and I see that you're still in that game today. So that's an interesting one. Things come full circle. So yes, I appreciate the invitation. So this, I had done some work on multiculturalism before, but not recently. So this has brought me back into this set of debates, mainly at the theoretical level, I have to say. So I appreciate that opportunity. And this actually is my first sort of serious and focused engagement with the Bristol School, which I'm glad that since we first met, it has become a school. And so appreciate that opportunity. In this session, I'm going to pick up some of the questions that Thomas Seeley raised a few months back in a seminar like this, when he introduced the notion of hospitality and proposed complementing multiculturalism with the notion of hospitality. I'm not going to use that concept tonight, but it seems to me that it has a strong affinity with what I'm trying to say. And before I start, let me thank also Simon Thompson, who gave me some extremely helpful comments on an earlier draft of the paper from which this is drawn, and has helped clarify certain issues regarding the school and regarding his own views. So I hope that this version of the paper is somewhat improved from the first version. There's still work to do, no doubt. So how should states recognize religion, inclusion without co-option? So I'm going to start by briefly trying to characterize start by really trying to work out how the slides work. Oh, I see. Right. That's the one. Yeah. Okay. That's it. Just briefly, try to characterize some central features and commitments of the Bristol School, particularly as regards the place of religion. So the Bristol School has proposed an overall approach, which Tariq and others have characterized as multicultural moderate secularism. And let me say, I have a strong affinity with this model. And what I'm going to do in this session is attempt to expound it and engage in a critical conversation with it and suggest pushing it in certain directions that I think it's already heading in anyway. What does this amount to? It wants to move beyond a mere neutral toleration of religion, religious communities, ethno-religious communities, on the basis of a purely negative individual right to freedom of religion and belief, takes that for granted, but wants to move beyond it towards a positive inclusion or accommodation of plural religious communities in the public realm, and an active harnessing of their potential contributions to the public good. So if I can just borrow a concept from Bhagava, who's an important theorist of secularism, who proposes that there should be a principled distance between the state and religion, you could say that this model argues for a principled proximity between the two. And this model wants to extend inclusion and accommodation, not just to religious individuals, but also to religious communities. So you could say that, and this is my term, that it expresses something like a sort of pluralistic communitarianism. Not the kind of communitarianism from the 1990s, which looked to the single national community as a sort of repository of shared values, at least not only that, but one which is internally diverse, and in which there are multiple communities participating in that larger national project. So this model wants to move beyond individualistic procedural equality, where the state simply adjudicates between individual rights, towards a substantive political equality for all citizens and their communities, religious and non-religious. And this notion of substantive political equality allows for differential or non-uniform treatment of religious citizens and their communities by the state. And as they put it, one size does not fit all when it comes to state-religion relationships. And at the heart of this model then is the notion of minimal secularism, which for the purposes of this talk, I'll just isolate a couple of its key commitments. One is that it refrains from imposing a secularist worldview on society. And it demands really only the principle of political autonomy, which is the idea of the non-subordination of the state to religious authorities, to religious purposes, and indeed to religious reasons. So that's why it's minimal. That's its central demand on a state and the relation between the state and religion. So these make up, I think, some of the central features of this model of multicultural moderate secularism. Now, this broad model has recently been given greater specification in a particular article of this title, The Multidimensional Recognition of Religion, by Simon Thompson and Tariq Modood, just from last year. And for the next part of the talk, I want to expound and build on this specific article, because I think it takes the debate forward in a very interesting and creative way. According to the multidimensional recognition of religion approach, states have what we authors call a non-absolute duty to recognize a number of religions, which it's likely they should discharge along different dimensions and to different degrees. That's the central recommendation. Not all states, but in all likelihood, most states should discharge such a duty. And they give the example, which I think fleshes it out helpfully, of Denmark and Finland in particular, in which there are three distinct tiers of state recognition of religion. And they call these, firstly, constitutional establishment, where there is an established church. There's one in Denmark, and there are two in Finland. Secondly, a category of registered religious communities, the status which brings with it a range of entitlements and opportunities, such as to deliver schools, run nursing homes, to seek public funding for their activities, and so forth. So that's a restricted set of religions that enjoy that second-tier status. And in these two nations, the third category then is simply the category of religious associations, which means religious associations enjoying essentially identical rights to those of non-religious associations. So that's the kind of thing that is intended by the recognition of a variety of different religions in different dimensions and to different degrees. And briefly, I'm not assuming you've all read this article. I hope you will, because I think it's a very interesting one. The argument moves by way of what they call an iterative contextualism. And very briefly here, I can only skip over this. We can pick that up in discussion if you wish. It operates by means of identifying a series of what they call operative public norms present in a series of different contexts, Denmark, Finland, France, etc., anywhere else, the UK. And by interrogating these operative public norms and analyzing them, out of that process is yielded two principles of recognition: the principle of identification and the principle of discretionary recognition. So let me just say a little bit about each of these two. The principle of identification, according to the principle of identification, the state has a non-absolute duty to ensure that citizens can identify with their political community in the sense of owning their membership, feeling a sense of belonging to the political community, and not regarding membership of the political community as a mere fact or purely as a means of pursuing their own interests. So the capacity to identify with one's political community is presented as an intrinsic good and an instrumental good. It allows the state to discharge some of its own responsibilities for public policy, for social cohesion, solidarity, and so forth. And it's also a demand of political equality. That's the principle of identification. The principle of discretionary recognition is that the state may choose to give recognition to one or more religions above that level required for identification. And they suggest three contextual arguments that could warrant such recognition above that level. The first is a historical formation argument. And this is where religion, a religion or more than one religion, has played such a prominent role in the very formation of the state that it seems to merit some kind of official recognition as such. The second is a political identity argument, where a religion's influence in sustaining contemporary political identity warrants certain kinds of specific recognition. That political identity could also be a national identity. I think typically it will be. The third argument is what I've called a public contribution argument, which is that recognition is merited where religion has made an exemplary contribution to the public good. In fact, they cite the Church of England, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail later, as an example of a discretionary recognition which meets all these three arguments, which responds to all these three arguments. It's clear that the Church of England has played an important historical role in the formation of the British state. It has historically, at least, helped sustain the contemporary political identity of Britain, or at least England, and it continues to offer a variety of contributions to the public good through education, through other social services, and through, for example, opening up its own resources and access and status to a variety of other faiths as well. So let me just spell out some further features of the two principles. First of all, decisions on discretionary recognition are permitted, but not obligatory. So the state is under no duty to recognize religion over and above that which is required for the principle of identification. So it's a permissive principle, not a binding principle. The principle of identification takes priority over the principle of discretionary recognition. So no act of discretionary recognition, whether it's by sustaining an established church or conferring particular benefits on a religious faith-based provider, social service provider, whatever it might be, no such discretionary act could be justified if it significantly undermines the capacity of certain citizens, other citizens, to identify with their political community. And thirdly, against a widely held understanding of liberal neutrality, discretionary recognition, differential treatment, in other words, need not undermine identification. Now, they do note in a different article that establishment as one instance of discretionary recognition may perhaps threaten the principle of identification. This is an empirical possibility. It may cause what they call othering or alienation. It's in another article from 21. But their key claim here is that it need not do so, and they claim that the Church of England does not cause such othering or alienation. And the principal empirical argument there, which I have to concede, although I'm not fully persuaded by it, is a pretty compelling one, is that there are almost no voices among minority faith communities in Britain that oppose the established status of the Church of England. On the contrary, when asked, most of them are actually enthusiastic about it. And we will no doubt hear that more in the next month around the coronation. So I recognize that as a sort of quite a compelling counter argument to the direction in which I'm going to move. And the final feature of the principle that I just want to highlight here is that discretionary recognition should not be seen as a sort of fixed settlement for once and for all, but should always be open to renegotiation. And the drift of what the argument is that it should be open to renegotiation in a more pluralistic and more inclusive direction. And so in the article, they suggest, for example, possibility of a more multi-faith coronation as an example of that. That would be a significant shift from 1953, where the service was exclusively Christian and Anglican. Many voices have been hoping since then that the next coronation will accommodate a variety of different faith voices in one way or another. The powers that be are remaining very tight-lipped about this. We know very little about the nature of the service on May the 6th, but the initial signs are that, in fact, this will probably not happen, or at least not happen anything like as much as some people would have wished. In any event, that's just one example. The point is that these regimes of recognition are constantly up for renegotiation. So that's a very brief sketch of the central features of the argument in that article. In the next few slides, I want to probe the concept of recognition a little bit further and make some suggestions. So the first point to make is this, and I owe this to Simon, who very helpfully clarified this in some exchanges we had. I think I've got this right. You'll tell me if I haven't, but discretionary recognition assumes a non-discretionary recognition of equal status. That's the sort of baseline from which discretionary recognition proceeds, sometimes called a deontological recognition. That's a recognition of certain fundamental equal rights, equal statuses. Which means that recognition includes, but also exceeds religious freedom, both negative rights to religious freedom and positive rights to religious freedom. I think we'd also say that it seems clear from the intention that a robust regime of religious freedom is necessary to meet the minimum threshold of identification. If there is not a generous regime of religious freedom, it's very likely that certain minorities are going to experience a degree of alienation from their political communities. This seems to be part of the minimum baseline, the non-discretionary baseline. So in other words, all faiths, all religions, and indeed one could extend that to include, freedom of religion and belief, all philosophical and moral visions and perspectives are entitled to enjoy equal rights to religious or conscientious freedom. So often this will involve identical rights, identical treatment, whether that's rights, opportunities, access, property registration, for example, equally available to all religious organizations. It's a huge problem, of course, in a number of European countries where states penalize certain minorities, or occasionally majorities, by making it very difficult for them to, register to build houses of worship and so forth. So that's part of this minimum baseline of identical treatment will be part of that minimum baseline. But it seems to me the principle of substantive political equality also allows, or indeed mandates, certain kinds of differential treatment. For example, exemptions to otherwise generally applicable laws in employment, dress, and so forth. Both of these then are part of this minimum baseline, this non-discretionary baseline. And that's an important point because many liberals who are committed to the principle of neutrality will claim that exemptions are sort of concessions or particular benefits which only certain faiths enjoy, and therefore reject the very idea of these exceptions because they seem to depart from equal treatment. Whereas on this view, and I think this is the Bristol School's view, something like a regime of exemptions, so that, for example, a religious organization can hire officers exclusively of its own faith, for example, is implied by substantive political equality. And we can connect this to the idea of pluralistic renegotiation. It seems to me that it follows here that the existing regime of religious freedom, in other words, in any state, needs to be open to pluralistic renegotiation at this level as well. So, for example, some religious freedom defenders, those who've defended the autonomy and rights of religious communities and religious organizations, have argued that the principle of reasonable accommodation of religion in employment, whereby employers accommodate religious dress, religious practice, religious prayers, and so forth in the workplace setting, should not be left, as it were, to ad hoc local negotiation, which by and large it is in the UK at least, but should be put on a statutory basis, as it is, for example, in Canada, where there is a statutory obligation on employers to offer reasonable accommodation to religious conscience or religious identity, subject to certain conditions, high cost or impracticability, and so forth. Now, I want to sort of try to expand the field a little bit wider than the remit of this particular article. And I want to do so first by extending the three tiers of recognition that the authors identify as particular contextual examples: constitutional establishment, registered religious communities, and religious associations. I want to sort of generalize these into three broader categories of recognition, which of course are not exhaustive. There may be other categories of recognition that don't yet fall under these. And so I'm calling the first constitutional recognition, the second public service recognition, and the third generic associational recognition. And I'll try to explain those in turn in reverse order, so from the bottom up, so to speak. So what I mean by generic associational recognition is where a religious association enjoys the same legal standing as any other religious or non-religious association in law. So there's no distinction, there's no differential treatment here at all. And this seems to me to be part of that regime of equal religious freedom. And indeed, more broadly, a regime of equal associational freedom for society as a whole. So the rights, powers, and duties implied in the generic associational recognition of religion then will be seen as part of the essential minimum baseline of all state religion relations, whether identical or differential. I'm not going to say more about that because I think it's the least controversial claim. Now, why do I emphasize the term associational here? The point I want to make here is that I think the Bristol School could benefit at this point from taking a leaf out of the theory of associations, which emerges out of a strand of democratic theorizing. So typically the Bristol School uses the language of groups or communities, religious communities, ethno-religious communities, and so forth. Just does occur to me that this kind of language does risk falling into a kind of vagueness and a lack of specificity when it comes to questions of state recognition, and that greater specification can be given to both kinds of recognition, both minimum baseline deontological recognition and discretionary recognition, if we identify specific organized associations that are going to be the recipients, the beneficiaries of such recognition. So in other words, we don't simply talk in very general and I think somewhat vague terms about, let's say, British Asians or the Muslim community or Muslim communities, but much more specifically of bodies like the Bangladeshi Cultural Association, which is a registered body that you can identify, or the Muslim Council of Britain, or a local council of mosques, which exist in many cities where there's a significant Muslim population. Now, associational theory wishes to, as it were, play at the significance of recognizing the social agency of these particular associations and their legal personality. In other words, by contrast to, let's say, a phrase like the Muslim community, because the Muslim community is not an agent. It doesn't have a registered address. It can't bear rights. It can't act. It can't do anything. Whereas a specific association, possesses exactly that. It possesses what you could call legal personality, it possesses social agency, and it also brings with it a variety of other benefits. So associations like these and many others, function as generators of social capital, schools of civic virtue or democratic virtue, and more broadly, as bulwarks of a robust civil society able to contain state encroachment or state excesses. Now, this is not in contradiction to, I think, anything that the Bristol School claims. On the contrary, it seems to be entirely consonant with it. But I do think that their multicultural theory in general, could be reinforced and given greater specification if it drew on this particular strand of associational theory and incorporated into its larger model. It seems to be there under the surface, and sometimes it's on the surface, but I think it could be given greater prominence. That, I think, would help specify in detail what recognition actually amounts to. So then we'd avoid, as it were, generalized language. I'm not accusing anybody in this room of that, of course, but some, we would avoid generalized language claims to the effect that the state ought to recognize or accommodate the Muslim community or the Hindu community, which is far too vague. So that's generic associational recognition, and that gave me the opportunity to suggest that the Bristol School should learn from associational theory. The second category that I want to highlight is public service recognition. This is my term, by which I mean an entitlement granted by the state to provide a public service, finding that term quite broadly, a service to which the state is itself already committed. So this could involve, for example, a religious organization being licensed or accredited to perform a particular public service, whether it's running a school or a drug rehabilitation center or whatever it might be, It could involve full or partial funding. It could involve differing balances of autonomy versus regulation, depending on the specific kind of service or kind of function being performed. So, for example, a faith-based school, which wants to operate within the public sector, as opposed to being private or independent, will quite understandably and necessarily come within a range of generic regulations governing the school sector as a whole, although not necessarily all of them. You know, by virtue of recognizing a faith school as a distinct kind of school, there will need to be a certain degree of distinctive autonomy that's retained by that body if it's to discharge its function in any kind of distinctive way. And if not, then what's the point of recognizing it as such? Now, normally, public service recognition will be possible on the basis of some sort of statutory provision. So, you know, education legislation, for example, will provide for the possibility of faith schools and set certain conditions and so forth to make them possible. And that's fine. That's will normally be the case, but it has occurred to me that there could also be public service recognition on a sort of entirely voluntary basis. And so here I mention something called the Faith Covenant, which some of you may have heard of. This was generated in 2014 by, interestingly, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society. So it's actually generated by a group of MPs who were concerned about rising tensions between religious social service providers, religious schools and others, and local authorities. And it was an attempt to encourage a kind of best practice agreement. So it's not statutory in that there are no statutory obligations involved, but local authorities are invited to sign up to the Faith Covenant, essentially. And I think as 2 years ago or so, there were something like 20 or so that had done so. Anyway, according to discretionary recognition in this category, only some religions will enjoy state support in the provision of public services. But this is justifiable, so the argument goes, and I agree at this point, in terms of the public contribution argument. So if a religious community has the resources and the wherewithal to generate a network of faith-based schools or other social service provision, then it's perfectly justifiable for the state to grant it those entitlements in a way that it hasn't granted to other faith communities who either don't have the capacity or don't have the desire to do so. So I think there's no discrimination, there's no illicit discrimination involved here, where the differential status, according to different religious providers, simply reflects differences of demand or differences of resources. However, under this category of recognition, there are two possible kinds of discrimination that I think we need to be aware of and to guard against. And I'll deal with these two quite quickly. One is called majority bias and the other is called secularist bias. So majority bias occurs where a differential status doesn't just reflect a proper difference of resources or desires, but reflects some kind of historically embedded structural bias that discriminates unfairly against some minority, which is thereby excluded from the possibility of providing such a service. So there could be hidden discriminatory hurdles, such as those that possibly face those wishing to set up Muslim schools in a system which is dominated both by Christian and secular models of education. Or there could be dominant but unacknowledged values such as curricular biases, which would make, let's say, the provision of a school much more feasible for certain kinds of religious communities and not others, for example. And here the risk specifically is of exclusion, that because of these, this particular kind of majority discrimination, a minority group is excluded from the possibility of public service recognition illicitly. Secularist bias, by contrast, is where the conditions for participation in public service provision reflect not a majority bias, but a secularist ethic, acknowledged or not, that is needlessly constraining the religious identity of a provider. So, for example, here is one quotation from a report from 2008, which looked precisely at this question and concluded this, that government's decision to ignore theology as a governance criterion for the provider, for the religious provider, means that the state has delineated what constitutes good religion and asserted that faith did not impact on organizational behavior, thereby privatizing the consequences of religious ideas. So in other words, the secularist ethic, as it were, is screening out or unable to register the force of certain theological or religious ideas, and therefore misconstrues what the provider wishes to do and what it might contribute, and arbitrarily prevents it from doing so. Another example would be an important legal case in 2009, the JFS case, Jewish Free School case, in which an Orthodox school was required by law to abandon its long-standing admissions policy. And indeed, a whole range of other Jewish schools, as a result of that, were forced to revise their admissions policies as well. But now Lord Brown, who was one of the judges in the case, said this, that finding that the Jewish school practiced a racially discriminatory admissions policy, which is what the case actually did conclude, would mean, quote, insisting on a non-Jewish definition of who is Jewish, and the imposition of a test for admission to an Orthodox Jewish school, which is not Judaism's own test. So with majority bias, the risk is the risk of exclusion. With secularist bias, I think the risk is the risk of co-option. That is, a religious provider is permitted to provide a service, but only at the cost, improperly constraining its right to manifest, key implication of the right to religious freedom, and thereby diminishing a potentially distinctive contribution to some public service. And as I said before, if regulations that reflect a secularist bias essentially force all providers into an identical mold, so that religious providers are simply religious in name only, the substance of what they provide is virtually identical to what everybody else provides, what then is the point of recognizing them for that purpose? And then thirdly, moving higher up, constitutional recognition. Now, I call it constitutional recognition rather than simply constitutional establishment, because establishment is only one case of this category that I want to propose. So, for example, in 1972, the Catholic Church in Ireland lost its established status, which had been granted in 1937, but nevertheless, Christianity remained constitutionally recognized in the preamble to the Constitution. So there you have a case of constitutional recognition, which did not involve establishment. Hence, I want to sort of stretch that category to include those sorts of cases. Constitutional recognition means the affording of a special public status for one or more religions in some form of constitutional law, whether that is the Constitution as such, a constitutional document, or in some constitutional statute, or even in a constitutional convention. So it's just occurred to me recently that the coronation, forthcoming coronation, is under statutory constraint in that the coronation oath is defined in a statute. But the fact that the Church of England presides over the coronation, as far as I can tell, is entirely conventional. There's no statutory basis, and there's nothing in, because we don't have a written constitution that you can point to. It's an entirely conventional thing. So in other words, I want to broaden the category to include all of those different cases and not only cases of establishment. And the nature of that special status can vary widely. It can range across the spectrum of strong to weak establishments, strong as in Greece, for example, weak as in England, say, the payment of ministerial salaries by the state, the imposition of a church tax, as in Germany, for example, symbolic recognition, as in Ireland after 72, differing degrees of state supervision, and so forth. So it's a complex category with multiple different sorts of manifestation in. And the point I want to make here is that justifying any such discretionary recognition at this level demands the case-by-case deployment of one or others of the three arguments that I mentioned earlier. That's historical formation, political identity, or contribution to the public good. And that's not a straightforward task, it seems to me. It's going to be more or less difficult in particular cases. And I tend to think that it's actually really quite difficult to justify that kind of recognition as distinct to public service recognition. Well, I want to now illustrate that briefly by means of a case study of the Church of England itself, which I've already mentioned in passing. And I want to just to illustrate the complexity here and the uphill struggle to justify constitutional recognition by trying to show that when we look in fine detail at the contents of the establishment of the Church of England, it really does become quite difficult to justify any of them in terms of the three arguments that have been presented. Now, this is one case study. It doesn't make a broad case against constitutional recognition as such. That would be a much bigger project. But at least if this argument holds, it casts a certain doubt on it. So here I've identified 9 features of establishment, and I'm thinking of high establishment. That's the constitutional level of the establishment of the Church of England. So run through these, and as well, ask yourself, which of these could be justified, either in terms of the historical formation argument, in terms of the political identity argument, or in terms of the public service contribution argument. And the first is that Anglicanism is uniquely recognized as the official religion in England, while also playing a key constitutional role for the whole of the UK. That's the fundamental feature. The state has a duty in the person of the monarch to defend Protestantism in England and Scotland. Quite difficult to see how any of the three arguments justify that. Since 1534, the head of state is the head of the church, the supreme governor, exercised via the crown in Parliament. And that then means that the governing authority of the Church of England itself, unlike any other religious body in the UK, is a delegation from Parliament. It doesn't possess that authority intrinsically. It's delegated by Parliament, specifically in the Enabling Act of 1919, which you probably haven't heard of before and might never have to think about again, but just to let you know. Some further features following that logic. The Church's internal legislation require approval by Parliament via what's called the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament. Just a quick straw poll. How many of you here have heard of the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament? I thought Professor Modood would, yes. But yes, it's something that you have to be quite nerdy to know that kind of fact. It's really quite a specific issue. But that is a powerful committee that exercises not just ceremonial, but sometimes quite substantive control over the church's internal decisions. The next feature, that the church's law is part of public law. Again, that's completely unique in the UK. The church's senior appointments still need formal ratification by the Crown via the office of the Prime Minister, although since 2007, this has been reduced to a formality, but it's still there technically on the books. 26 Lords Spiritual, the bishops in the House of Lords, are entitled to sit and vote in the second chamber and preside over daily official prayers. And finally, the Church enjoys automatic precedence in presiding over national ceremonies, most importantly, the coronation. Now, I'm going to skip fairly quickly here because time is short, but it seems to me it's really quite difficult to justify pretty much any of these very specific elements of Anglican establishment in terms of the three arguments that have been proposed. Skip that part. And anyway, broadly speaking, this then suggests, I think, the need for a pluralistic renegotiation of the constitutional status of the Church of England in the direction of disestablishment. In other words, if the arguments sustaining it no longer carry weight or seem, very difficult to sustain, then it's difficult to retain the broader apparatus of establishment as such. Now, that, as I say, doesn't undermine the very category of constitutional recognition, but it's one source of evidence for an attitude of suspicion towards constitutional recognition in other settings as well. Now I want to move more towards an articulation of my own position, quite briefly. How are we doing for time, Tariq? You started about
22, yeah. So you've had 40 minutes and
yeah,
you could have 8 to 10 minutes.
It's 10 minutes, all right. So now I want to suggest, that what we need to aim for is recognition, indeed including discretionary recognition, but without the risk of what I've called co-option. And here, I want to shift the angle somewhat. So far, the argument has looked at recognition from the state's perspective, what the authors call downwards vertical recognition by the state of religious individuals or religious communities. But what about the question of recognition from the bottom up, from the perspective of religious communities, upwards vertical recognition? And here I want to bring in some insights from the dissenting traditions of Christian political theology, dissenting traditions within Anglicanism and also beyond Anglicanism, in the nonconformist tradition, but also in some elements of the Roman Catholic tradition, which place a question on the legitimacy of constitutional recognition and raise the question of the risk of the co-option of religion by the state under a regime of constitutional, or indeed any kind of recognition. Two basic theological claims emerge from this dissenting tradition. One is a pretty robust affirmation of the religious incompetence of the state. This goes back specifically to the 17th century, which is where the dissenting tradition got going. And out of it was developed a theology of the limits of the state's authority, deriving from an understanding of the difference between the New Testament and the Old Testament. And the claim here is that in the New Testament, there is a radical shift in the very nature of the people of God and its relationship to the political order, which makes any kind of constitutional recognition problematic. And cutting a long story short, the argument here is that the state, as a result of that shift, no longer has any authority to offer any special recognition of religion or religions at all. In other words, it leads to the logic of the principle of religious reality. The second principle is the principle of the autonomy of the church, which from my account of Church of England establishment, you can already tell in that case, faces some quite significant constraints. But here the argument is that the church is not simply part of society, it's not simply an expression of the nation, it's not part of the nation or part of the state, it's a fully independent body empowered to govern its own spiritual affairs according to its own received doctrine under the authority of Christ. And this argument is sharpened by those who would want to say that the church in every age, in every context, wherever possible, is obliged to take a critical stance towards the state, not principally an affirming stance towards the state, or what's called a prophetic stance towards the state, on the assumption that commitments to justice, peace, compassion, the common good, equality, whatever it might be, as Christians understand them, are likely to come into contact at some point or other with extant state laws or policies, or with broader national values. And if that's the case, then of course, the very concept of a national church, which is presupposed in establishment, becomes very problematic. So the church is not, first of all, a resource for social cohesion or national unity, but rather a countercultural presence, rather like the early church was vis-a-vis pagan society, against which it found itself seriously and frequently at odds, and not only when it was being persecuted, but because it embodied a completely different set of social and political values. This means then that the church will want to critique the operative public norms that it finds in any context, in any society. That it might indeed even unsettle a nation's political identity rather than shoring it up, or simply being part of the rich fabric of that identity. And even therefore that it might expect to experience a degree of alienation from its political community. Indeed, in some renditions of this theology, the absence of a feeling of an experience of alienation from a political community is a sign of unfaithfulness. It's a sign of loss of integrity. And this, I think, suggests that Christianity, at least, would be parallels in other religious traditions too, will find themselves, insofar as they are being faithful to their own identities, in an agonistic posture towards the state, which I would contrast here with what Tariq, in one of his articles, maybe more than one, has called an additive construal of religious identity. So, as I understand it, an additive notion means that political identity will be enriched by means of diversification, thereby deepening inclusion. But my question is, a purely additive notion seems to risk the project of incorporating religious identities on the state's terms at the expense of religious identity or religious autonomy. So I'm not, as it were, rejecting the notion of an additive idea. I'm, as it were, flagging up a warning that it may have the effect of muting or blunting what certain religious communities will want to think of as an agonistic, indeed antagonistic stance towards the state. So the result of this may well be a thinner political identity, but arguably I would suggest a more inclusive one, because it facilitates a fuller manifestation of religious identity. And the fear here is that too close intertwinements of church, church or religion with the state creates a standing co-option. And I could give you some examples from the recent practices of the Church of England, if you wish. So, to conclude, so far I've talked about the problem of co-option from the standpoint of religion, that it might find itself, as it were, compromised in terms of its identity. But I want to suggest that co-option is also a problem for the state. And briefly, only sketch this argument, which I'm sure you'll want to come back on. In a healthy deliberative democracy, the state, we could say, has a positive duty to sustain conditions in which agonistic critique can emerge. The state has an interest in meeting the requirements of the principle of identification, certainly, and that does suggest as deep and broad inclusion as possible. But it also has an interest in facilitating the normative critique of the state itself. And religion, as a number of commentators have recognized, can sometimes provide that resources for pretty fundamental and normative critiques of the state. So we could say then that this is part of the state's duty to facilitate active critical citizenship. States shouldn't seek passive or compliant religious associations. That might be convenient. It might make public policy administration easier. But it should positively seek religious communities that effectively call the state to account, if necessary, via robust opposition or indeed disruption. So, to conclude, my suggestion then is that Bristol School can be enriched by two additional dimensions, that the state recognition of religion should then be framed by this is hardly a good election slogan, by the way. Agonistic, associational, multicultural, moderate secularism. Let me stop there. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much, and in particular for managing the time, given, you know, the very wide-ranging nature of your argument, which of course works at a number of different levels, which is not a criticism, I mean, it's a virtue, but it does mean that for any of us, we could accept the argument at one level without necessarily accepting the entailment or the accompaniment that you offer at another level, i.e. we could break it apart and reconnect different parts that you yourself, I know we're doing what Simon and I've done, disconnecting and then connecting somewhere else. So we can have questions both from here and from a very nice group of people on following us online. Anyone like to kick off? You do, Chris? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I'm always a bit suspicious about the word religion. It covers a multitude of sins as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I would say I hold to the gospel of Jesus Christ, but if anyone were to ask me if I was religious, I would answer no. I will come on to that later. And again, the problem between church and state, I mean, again, historically, I think many of the church's problems still stem from the conflict and settlement of the church from the state. Luther then, whilst rebelling against it, on the one hand, had to get into bed with the German princes to save his neck. Calvin had to go to the Genevan magistracy and all the rest of it. And although the Church of England, at least comparatively, historically, is reasonably cuddly at the moment, if you look back historically, it's been hugely oppressive towards Catholicism, non-conformists, the rest of it. Again, the Russian Orthodox Church's attitude in the Ukraine of the LGBT people is not good, shall we say. And I always like the definition of the state is a cockerel crowing on its own dunghill. So, you know, I'm very cautious about getting into bed with states. I'll argue against myself there. If then you look at the United States, where there is freedom of religion, you know, I can't put it very diplomatically, but it's turned out a lot of very wacky manifestations. So I think there's something to be looked at there as to quite what the motives behind that are. Again, I'd end on this thing that, yes, if you like, Jesus went to the synagogue, but he overturned the tables in the synagogue or in the temple, and he had conflicts with the religious establishment. So this is why I'm wary of the word, if you like, religion in this context. So obviously, the state, if you like, exists in reality, so somehow we've got to negotiate that one, and it takes a bit of sensitivity on some side or the other. And the other thing with the state, you know, if you look at what happened in China with the Uyghur Muslims, this is where the power of the state has been used in an oppressive way, which is not unique within Christian history. Anyway, those are sort of few reflections rather than a particular question, but I think it sort of teases out some of the issues you were dealing with.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I appreciate that point fully, and that's one reason why I did choose the specific example of the Church of England. You know, try to do a sort of fairly close scrutiny of the nuts and bolts of that and its relationship to the state. You know, I think we'd all agree that generic and vague statements about religion and the state, you know, the relation between religion and the state are largely unhelpful. To get into the fine grain of what kind of a state you're talking about and what its agenda is and what kind of religion you're talking about. And you can only do that by means of these detailed studies of something like, you know, the Church of England or whatever else it might be. So appreciate the point very much. And, you know, what you said about the complexity of the Church of England's relationship to the British state, English-British, which is another complication, of course, is one reason why I think the historical formation argument, which you know, Simon and Tariq propose as justifying discretionary recognition, is problematic. It's not that you can rewrite history, the history's there, but that history is deeply ambivalent.
Yeah.
And for much of its history, since the 16th century, when it became, as it were, newly established, up to Henry VIII's nationalization church, was usually on the wrong side of history. I mean, for much of its history, it was on the wrong side of that history. It sustained persecution, it sustained intolerance, and then either tacitly or explicitly, it sustained imperialism, among other things. So it's quite an ambivalent claim, I think, to say that on the basis of its formation of its key role in the formation of the state, that it somehow has merited today some kind of specific recognition. I mean, this is one reason why I, as an Anglican, right, who's very attentive and aware of that ambivalent history, would like to disavow that recognition, because I think it plays into a muting of a recognition of that complexity and of the injustices that the church has been involved in. So yes, thank you for that. I take the point very much. Now, of course, the other point here is that I've already indicated that there are at least two key strands, even within Anglicanism. There's a sort of national church strand, and then there's the dissenting strand, which is the one I want to foreground. But then that's only two positions within Anglicanism. You then have to spread the net to look at all the different kinds of denominations. The relation between the state and church, of course, in Orthodoxy is profoundly different. You mentioned that. In Catholicism, again, very different in different settings. And once you get to look at other religions, then the picture becomes even more complicated. And incidentally, that's one reason why I think it's not enough to say that Anglicans should defend establishment because non-Christian minorities like it. Now, I take your point entirely that they do, as far as I can see. I remember you saying once, Tariq, you've never met you've never met a Muslim who opposed establishment. I actually did meet one a few weeks back, but never mind. I agree. The preponderant position of pretty much all the leading representatives of faith minorities in the UK is to defend establishment. So I take that point, but my response to that would be, for Anglicans and for Christians, we don't simply defer to that perception. We certainly want to take those concerns seriously. And there's a genuine issue at stake here, the genuine recognition that establishment does provide certain benefits for non-Christian minorities. It provides, so the argument goes, kind of overarching sacred canopy under which different non-Christian faiths can somehow enjoy a degree of protection and status. And I understand that. But I think the debate I'd want to have then with those representatives is to say, well, look, but don't expect us to compromise our distinctive tradition of church-state relations, or at least my distinctive tradition of church-state relations, by overly accommodating to your desire to profit from establishment. I think there's got to be a two-way argument. Anyway, that's enough on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I made a note of three things that I wanted to, as it were, respond to what I identified as critique, but I'm going to try and exercise a certain amount of forbearance for as long as I can. And I'm going to do the same in relation to Simon and allow other people to come in. So Greg Smith, you put a question in chat. Would you like to come on the screen and read out your question or?
Oh, yes. Hello, Jonathan. Nice to see you at the end of the camera. My question was about the relationship of religion and the local state. You mentioned faith covenants, which is one example. But the reality is that I think most faith communities and organizations actually operate primarily, I would say, at the local level. And therefore, they relate to local councils, local authorities. But the issue for me is that local authorities, the demographics, religious demographics vary considerably. Bradford is not Preston, is not Newham, is not Leicester, and it's certainly not Blackpool Liverpool or Cumbria. And so you may get a variety of relationships and partnerships. I mean, there are the issues of partnerships, funding, community development. It fits a little bit with your emphasis on associational theory, because I think the associations, religious associations, are very much local. So just saying, have you any thoughts on that? How your general principles might apply, and should it be legislated for, so there's a national pattern that local authorities should follow?
Yes, so thanks, Greg. Slide I skipped over is where I was going to draw the distinction between what's called high establishment and earthed establishment, distinction drawn by a theologian, Wesley Carr. High establishment referring to the constitutional architecture, earthed establishment referring to very much what you have in mind, which is the kind of organic embedded presence of churches, not just Anglican ones, of course, but principally Anglican ones in a variety of local communities. And, you know, insofar as that is experienced by those communities as a public good, and by the churches themselves as an authentic expression of mission, then let's maintain that and consolidate it and strengthen it wherever we can, even though it's a patchwork quilt across the country. In some cases, it's barely existent, in others, very strong. So, for example, there's a parish church, I think it's St. Margaret's, right in the centre of Luton, highly multicultural city, which has generated a centre for peace and reconciliation that does fantastic community building work in Luton. And it does so because of the advantages of it being the parish church plonked right in the city centre. So all of that's great, and you know, I want to support that, and I don't think that need be lost, should be lost with any tinkering at the constitutional level. That can carry on and should carry on. And I agree. I think associational theories can help explain why that's important. And there, the idea is that you're not simply theorizing about individual discrete associations and championing their rights. You're also pointing to their role in a sort of nested network of local communities with all kinds of interactions and generating all kinds of social capital, bridging capital and not just bonding capital and so forth. So all of that's, I think, valuable, however differentially spread it is across the country.
Thank you. So I think I got an opportunity to raise one of my three objections. I'll do that now, and then again, if other hands come up, we'll bring people in. So I'd like to respond to what I identify as the most general theoretical objection, what you might call the Bristol School approach. And I'll just speak in my own voice, with the expectation that Simon will more or less agree, but if he doesn't want to, that's fine. But I won't speak in the collective we. So, and this is to do with your suggestion that this approach to multiculturalism and religious diversity representation would be better formulated in terms of an associationalism. Obviously, there are theoretical elaborations of that, not least in, from the early 20th century English political and social theory. And why I don't want to agree with you on that. So firstly, I think that the starting point where I want to start, where I have started, and where associationalism starts are two different places. So I begin with people's identities. And identities have two aspects. One, which is relatively involuntary, imposed, can have a very oppressive character, the identities of people within a caste systems, identity within a racial hierarchy, all forms of racialization and stereotyping that we're all familiar with. But that can make people, that can be part of their identity. But that doesn't exhaust the framework of, or dynamics of identities. And identities have another part, which is a very important normative resource for multiculturalism, and that is people's own sense of who they are. But this sense of who they are is not as individuals, and it's not as members of an organization or association, but it's as members of something that you call vague, a group. It can be a tradition, it can be faith or a ethnic group, and so on. I think that's where one needs to begin. So I think of the very first, most general exercise of recognition by both state and civil society, meaning fellow citizens, to first start at that level, accepting people, including their identities, which they don't have to efface, or as it were, leave behind them, as co-citizens, as full and equal citizens with all the rights and obligations and sense of membership, terms of membership available to everybody else, but adapted to include their identities. So it's not a wrinkleless inclusion. It's in fact an inclusion that can require some adjustment, some necessary adjustment. And that's what multiculturalism is about. So if you begin with that, that leads to one fundamental level of recognition, which is recognition of people, not of associations. Of course, associations come in the train of that, but that's a secondary recognition. So recognizing Muslims is more fundamental, not vaguer necessarily, but more fundamental than recognizing the Muslim Council of Britain as a body that may speak, amongst other bodies, for Muslims that the state should not ignore, but include as an interlocutor, as a policy partner, whatever it may be. So yes, associations come in, but that's both ontologically, normatively, secondary level of recognition.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. That's one of those moments where you suddenly see something a bit more clear that's been staring you in the face, but you haven't quite named. It helps me to say this, so I don't see these as alternatives in any sense. There's no zero-sum game between recognizing associations and recognizing communities. Rather, I simply see recognizing associations as simply a specification, a concrete specification, a more effective concrete specification of what you're talking about in terms of identity recognition. At least it's one way to specify it. There are numerous ways in which recognizing British Muslims, let's say, has to take place. And one couldn't really enumerate all of them. There's all sorts of different manifestations and expressions of that, the state's duty to recognize its Muslim citizens as Muslims. And so I'm with you on that. But one of them would be, that's all I'm suggesting, I think, one of them would be to say that you need to pay full attention to the variety, specificity, and agency of Muslim associations, among many others. That's okay. So it's an attempt to specify that, not to, as it were, pose an alternative between the two. And so I wouldn't want to start a notion of recognition with associations. But all I'm suggesting is that I think if you talk more about associations, your notion of recognition will get more concrete.
Okay, that's not really what your slide said. Your slide said, they do it like this. I propose its improvement by turning to a theory of associationalism. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying the theory of associationalism presupposes, in my framework, presupposes a more fundamental level, both ontologically, which really means sociologically, and normatively. So I'm saying something different. I'm not saying, talking about recognizing a Muslim Council of Britain doesn't make sense or anything like that. I'm saying it comes further down the logical order. If the state wanted to say, look, we want to help Muslims have a school, they can't just say Muslims in general. They have to say, well, which Muslims? Who are you talking to? So, of course, there will be a specific organization, and they may call themselves, you know, the Luton Sunni movement for civic education. And that's who you then talk to. They're an association. They will have members. They will have a constitution. They'll elect officers who'll go and talk to the Minister of State or Luton Borough Council or whatever it is. But I'm saying all that happens at a lower level of, if you like, ontology and normative recognition.
Okay, thank you. I'll need to think further about that, but I don't immediately resist what you're saying. I think it may be that we're laying different degrees of emphasis on these different stages, so to speak, of recognition. So certainly associations are not, as it were, you know, ahead of the pack in terms of state recognition. They are simply one object, many of recognition. And well, I certainly see that recognizing a body like MCB, which, as far as I understand it, currently government isn't officially talking to anymore, stopped doing so. It ought to start again, obviously. And if it did start talking to that association again, that would send a very powerful signal about the importance of Muslim identity in Britain as a whole, Muslim citizens in Britain, which is your concern. So I don't think there's a disagreement here, but I'll have to think further about that as to whether there actually is one. You seem to think there is. In my slide, I didn't mean to suggest any kind of alternative or bifurcation, but rather just a specification.
Okay, well, I think I am taking a harder view than you, because I'm talking about logical precedence, or logical in terms of a normative logic or ontological logic. I'm talking about precedence. You did sound a bit binary. If you're saying you don't mean it to be binary, fine, but I'd still want to insist on my precedence. Yeah.
I mean, I think more broadly, I want to say that, so I mean, I operate with a sort of a threefold categories of diversity. I can find this helpful, sort of religious or spiritual, you could say, cultural and association. I spell this out in one of the other books a little bit. And a key claim is that it's absolutely essential to maintain all three simultaneously in pretty much every situation. And whether there's a rank ordering is an interesting question. And I'm going to have to think a bit further about that in relation to this discussion. So thank you for that.
Okay, well, that's good. Yeah. So I'm looking to the screen to see if anyone's put their hand up. If you have been thinking about putting your hand up, I haven't done so yet. Now's a moment when you may do so, but also in the room. If anyone wants to ask a question, and it can be quite different to what we've had so far, or it can build on what we've had so far. Because otherwise you'll have to listen to one of my other questions.
Or Simon's.
Or Simon's, yeah. If you've got one, Simon,
yeah,
go ahead.
So there's no one online at the moment.
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tariq. You did permit me, I think, to dissent from your articulation of the position.
Okay.
And I'm going to do so to some extent, I think.
Okay.
In pretty vague terms, because this actually only occurred to me today and yesterday. Suddenly, as I was looking through your slides, not when I was looking through your earlier paper, Paul Hurst's book, Associative Democracy, 1994, because I looked it up, popped into my head, where he's reviving in a contemporary way the ideas of the early 20th century philosophy and physics, figures and so on. And that helped me to understand where you were coming from. And I thought it was actually potentially a rich vein to mine. Because what I thought initially was that you'd simply mistaken two parts of the position that Tariq and I articulated. Because we gave those examples of Finland and Alsace-Moselle and so on. And we said there seem to be quite often three tiers of recognition that people get. So crudely, you know, some religions are given lots of goodies and some are given some and some are given a few. You get constitutional status and you can set up schools. You can only set up schools, but nothing in the constitution, so on. And that they were examples of our main point, which was to defend the multidimensional recognition of religion. And then you talked about the 3 reasons we give for discretionary religion. Historical importance, importance to political identity, current contribution. And you say there's a kind of loose correlation between some of those tiers and some of those reasons. And that's where I thought you'd simply mistaken 2 quite different aspects of what we were talking about. So on the one hand, we have this normative position driven by 2 principles. We apply these principles to cases and we say, applying our principles of identification and discretionary recognition means that in the case of Lithuania, blah, 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 whereas in the case of Peru, something else. Well, that's kind of crudely our position in a sentence or 2. So some religions get nothing, some get more than others. And it's kind of context bound to some significant degree. But the reason why you might give additional recognition to some groups is kind of different from the primary argument, which is driven by those principles. At least that's what I thought. But then when you started to talk about associations, I could make more sense of what you were saying, because if I remember Hurst right, and it's a long time since I read him, he says something like, we'll have a basic, thin constitutional state that will devolve as much social activities, social business, down to voluntary associations as we can. So we'll have associations running education, healthcare, welfare, and so on. And I started to wonder whether that might be a productive way to think about one way of working out some of the things that you're committed to, one possible way of working it out. But as I was thinking about this, I think there is an issue, which is that Hurst is quite strict on regulation of association. So he says, of course, any voluntary association, which is licensed by the state and funded by the state to provide some services or another, must obey this robust set of regulatory rules. So it must not discriminate about entry, it must not restrict exit, it must comply with certain standards of democratic governance and so on. And that to me is, in a certain sense, quite an appealing political vision. So we're miles away from recognition of multiculturalism at the moment, just talking about associative democracy. But then I wonder how far you can go down the Hurst route. And I think I'm very gradually coming to my point. Because of your concerns about co-option, about what policy Maggie Powell called institutional isomorphism, when a big institution swallows a small institution and reshapes it into its own image. Because if you are worried about the autonomy of religious associations, you're worried about the danger of co-option and so on. If you worry about a religious association not being able to live in accordance with its own religious ethos and so on, then I think you wouldn't be able to accept the version of associationism, which at least Hurst articulates. So then the devil is in the details, isn't it? It's how robust a set of regulative rules you want. Do you permit a particular association to provide educational services that says it's going to teach creationism alongside evolution? Do you permit educational association to provide education separated by gender and so on? And you may wish to allow for more diversity, certainly than a Hurst would allow. And I'm simply not sure at the moment what my position is in all of this. But I do think there is something potentially appealing about this associational vision, which isn't, I don't think, in any sense challenge to the framework you've articulated. And I think, kind of in Jonathan's defense, I think he talks about it more as a complementary idea or notion, or something that may be added to the position you articulate. So I would, all I'm saying is, I would like to explore the idea further. I think it might be fertile, but I think there is tension between your concerns about co-option and the sort of co-option that I would probably want, because I think some co-option is good. So the state should say to an association, so you want to do this and you want state's money provided by general taxation, well, you have to play by our rules or you don't get the funding, you don't get the licensing. And I'm pretty happy with that, depending on what the rules are, of course.
That's really helpful. That's, you've got me pretty much right there, I think. So, yeah, I in many ways, I'm quite sympathetic to Hurst's position, and other similar sort of associative democracy theorists. But I had exactly the same concern about his specific model, which is that it was too heavy at the regulatory level. So I think you're right that my default inclination would always be against standardization, uniformity. So, there has to be, in American jurisprudential terms, a compelling state reason why there should be a regulation that circumscribes the free choice of the religious association. Well, you can make compelling state cases. I mean, of course you can. There are all sorts of protections and obligations that the state is perfectly obliged, indeed mandated, to impose on all associations. Whether it's something as seemingly trivial as transparent accounting, which is not trivial, of course, to safeguarding concerns, to anti-racism concerns. I mean, all of those things are legitimate. But I still think that there is, even given all that, which putative providers do have to sign up to, in terms that you suggested. Nonetheless, there is still, I think, greater scope than currently exists for greater religious autonomy for most religions. Too many arbitrary restrictions. And misplaced anxiety about to behind those doors. So there's a sort of, you're right, the devil is in the detail. So nobody can opt for simply, I think it's completely false choice to suggest that the state is the sort of possessor of plenary authority over the totality of society, and that it graciously concedes pockets of autonomy to various providers, whether religious or not. That's far too totalistic a view of state authority, even if it's democratic. On the other hand, but you can't have communities as complete islands of immunity. Deviate. So, earlier, with your help, I was talking about sort of minimum platform floor of religious freedom that the state has to maintain across the board, and conscientious freedom. That's only one of the elements of the minimum floor that the state has to impose on society on grounds of justice. I mean, all those other concerns I mentioned are part of that. So I think here we can talk about sort of tiered levels of regulation depending on the particular association. So there's a universal minimum that everybody has to subscribe to, and that would be, what I call generic associational recognition. It would come with conditions attached, obviously. So it would rule out, racially discriminatory practices and so forth, but it might not rule out. Indeed, for me, it would not rule out, for example, sex segregated education in a Muslim school, for example. Wouldn't rule that out entirely. Having boys and girls different classrooms, and lessons and so forth. That would seem to me to be, in principle, defensible. Equally, I mentioned the JFS case, the Jewish school. It seems to me that case was wrongly decided. That this was the state imposing illegitimately an admissions criteria on a Jewish school in a way that inevitably frustrated its core religious identity and the very raison d'etre for existing at all. So the devil's in the details. It's an important question what your default starting point is and where the onus of justification is. And for me, the onus of justification for regulating a religious association has always got to lie on the part of the state. It's got to justify its constraints rather than the religious association having to make a special case for its freedom, so to speak. Now, then it's down to negotiation and ultimately democratic decision, as you point out in your very article.
I would recommend Veit Bader as an associational theorist who was a one-time collaborator of Paul Hurst's, who I think has taken his associationalism very consciously and systematically to relate to what we would call ethno-religious diversity and so on. I still don't agree with it, but that's a better version in the existing literature that I know of. We seem to be doing quite well with keeping our online participants attending to us, or at least they haven't switched their computers off, but they haven't asked a question. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask one of my other questions, and that might be the last formal question, and then we could have more informal conversation outside with a drink and so on. And this one will be very brief. And it's like, it could be a starter. We could take the conversation outside if we wanted more elaborate. And that is, I'm just thinking about all your objections to the idea of constitutional recognition of an organized faith like a church or religious organization. And first of all, I like the reconceptualization of establishment into constitutional recognition. That suits me fine, because I think establishment is too narrow and specific a form of recognition of this sort. There can be wider ones. And I use the phrase myself, state-religion connections, but constitutional recognition to capture a particular level of recognition, one of the three. So your objections, you offered some in general, and then you said, well, let's look at the case of the Church of England. And when you elaborated some of that, you said, well, would that really be what we would be wanting today in terms of constitutional recognition? So my question is simply this: does your argument in general and specific to the case of England today rest upon there just being one recognized faith? Because it seemed to me that most of your objections were objections to singularity or monopoly rather than to that as a category of recognition. And as you know, Simon and I have crafted our argument so that it works for, as it were, multi-recognition. So if your best arguments were against constitutional recognition, well, it's just one church, what about all the others and so on, then we would want to come back and say, well, yeah, but we didn't argue that.
Okay. So certainly plural establishment, in general, there would be certain exceptions, but in general, would be a better scenario than single establishment. That is true on my terms. Because then, the privilege is less exclusive. The state is not identifying itself, and exceeding its authority by identifying there's simply one religion. And the sort of package of recognition could then be presented more plausibly as a significant stab at inclusion, as a genuine attempt to include. So, in terms of a gradation of desirable possibilities, yes, I would that. And from the state's point of view, one can see why that would tick a number of boxes that single establishment would like to suggest. But then the question is, where do you stop? I suppose there's that operational question. Where do you stop? So in the UK, who knows how many actual religions there are represented in any significant number? We're probably talking about dozens of religious faiths. Each tradition having its own minorities and minorities within minorities. So where do you stop? That's a very thorny political question. Wherever you stop, somebody on the other side of the line who's not included is going to feel aggrieved. So it's like parents showing favoritism to their children. It's a recipe for discontent. That's one practical problem from the state's point of view. From religion's point of view, that depends. There can be no single religious view of the desirability of plural establishment vis-a-vis single establishment. It's going to be religion specific. So Sunni Islam and Shia Islam generally is going to favor primacy for Islam as the official religion of the state. However much it might wish to accommodate minorities or other faiths in particular settings. And there are particular religious and theological reasons for that. Hinduism is going to produce a different set of preferences. Buddhism, different again. It's an important strand of Buddhism that opposes establishment in principle. So there'll be a multiplicity of views on that. And I think at that part of my talk, all I was saying was, here is one strand of one religious tradition which actually opposes the very idea of constitutional recognition on theological grounds. Now, that's not going to be compelling for the state. So the state has to adjudicate among a multiplicity of religions and perspectives. And the state is not simply going to say, indeed, it would be self-contradictory to say, the state now officially recognizes the dissenting tradition of Protestantism, which is opposed to establishment. And our patron saint is Roger Williams from, Massachusetts. So, but individual religious communities, such as one, the one that represents that view, will just keep on quietly lobbying away to edge the state closer to what they would see as their desired outcome, which they think is going to be better for everybody, and others will disagree with that. That's the start of an answer. So yes, I see the point of your question there, and one could meet halfway in practice. In any kind of, supposing there was some sort of constitutional an attempt to have a new constitutional settlement in the UK of state-religion relations. It's almost impossible to imagine it. It would be absolutely chaotic and anarchic. But if you could imagine getting enough people in the room for long enough, chaired by your good self, of course, with Simon as the sort of secretary and drafting the clauses.
Contradicting me too.
In that hypothetical scenario, what kind of outcome could you expect? Nobody's going to get everything.
Well, your suggestion of practical negotiations and meeting halfway is very welcome and a very good note to end on. And you'll be aware that Sunni Islam, or Islam in general, often self-defines itself as the middle way. So I think, thank you for taking that trouble to engage with Simon and my paper, and the theme more generally, including other Bristol work, and also for standing there for this long period of time, listening to our barrage of objections. I think you deserve a drink, and I think even the people attending online need a break. So this is the moment that we should conclude. Thank you, everybody, for joining us online, and of course for attending in person. Those of you who are here and are not fasting, please come out and have a drink, and also the possibility of a meal together later. So thank you and bye-bye. You'll learn more about our next seminar by email in the next few days. Thanks and bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan.